having with Dr. Bibek Debroy. I must mention this session was specially designed and requested by Dr. Arvind Virmani, who was the chairman of EGROW Foundation until a few days ago. He is now the member of the Niti Aayog, and today he had to chair the session, and we wanted him to chair the session because we had the session as he wanted it around this time, but he cannot attend for certain exigencies. So I am filling in his shoes, trying to fill in his shoes. As you know, EGROW Foundation is a research-based policy think tank in NCR, and our effort in the last 2 years has been to bring in the best minds from across the world to speak on contemporary issues. We are very fortunate that Dr. Bibek Debroy agreed to speak to us on a very important topic, governance. And he is going to speak to us from the literature in ancient texts. Actually, he needs no introduction, but just let me briefly say a few words about Dr. Bibek Debroy. As I've mentioned, he is the chairman of the PM's Economic Advisory Council. He was also from its inception in January 2015 till June 2019. He was the member of the Niti Aayog, the think tank of the Indian government. Dr. Debroy was awarded the Padma Shri in 2015. In 2016, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the US India Business Summit. Dr. Debroy has made significant contributions, very, very versatile, significant contributions to game theory, economic theory, income and social inequalities, poverty, law reforms. You must have been reading his articles on law and judiciary, which are eye-opening. Railway reforms, again, he has written so extensively on that, and Indology, amongst many others. Dr. Debroy has authored several books, papers, and popular articles, and has been the consulting editor of Indian financial and other newspapers. He was the chairman, member of various committees. He has taught at Presidency College, Calcutta, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and the National Council of Applied Economic Research. This is just a bird's eye view of the work he does and the intensity of the work that he does. To discuss his research, we have Professor Deodhar, a friend from IIM Ahmedabad. Professor Deodhar has been on EGROW a couple of times speaking about the ancient material. He teaches economics at IIM Ahmedabad. He completed his earlier studies at the Gokhale Institute and then received PhD from the Ohio State University. He has also worked on imperfectly competitive market structures, WTO, agricultural trade, food quality, CSR issues. He has worked on various issues related to agriculture, food. He has been on various administrative positions at the IIM Bangalore and on the board of a few companies. But the most important thing why we requested him to be here is because of his research on the ancient texts. And he, when he last was here with us, presented his own research on economics and the ancient text. With this brief introduction of both the speaker and the discussant, I would now like to invite Dr. Bibek Debroy to share his thoughts. Dr. Debroy, please.
Thank you, Charan. What you have not told me yet is how much do you initially want me to speak for? What duration?
I know you are busy. We are totally open. But
we have 1 hour.
We have 1 hour. So maybe if you can speak to us for 30-35 minutes, and Professor Deodhar can speak for 15-20 minutes, and we'll take a question or two and wrap it up within an hour.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Charan Singh and EGROW for having invited me to deliver this talk. After realizing who the discussant is, I wished I had not accepted because I'd much rather that Satish Deodhar spoke about the topic and I had the good fortune to listen and be the discussant. But anyway, here we are. The topic that Charan dictated to me, did not suggest, he dictated to me, is governance in our ancient texts. So we need to think a little bit about what these expressions mean, and we need to pin them down a bit. Governance and ancient texts, both of them. The word governance has become a buzzword. Everyone uses it. Is governance the same as government? If governance is the same as government, then why are we using two different words? There have been several attempts to pin down, quantify, and measure the expression governance, and even do cross-country comparisons. The World Bank has attempted it, EU has attempted it, the World Bank has governance indicators, the OECD has attempted it, all kinds of people have tried to do it. UNDP has. If you look at this, all this literature, you find that in its essence, the difference between governance and government boils down to one simple factor. Governance also involves the decision-making process. So it also involves the participation of citizens, whereas government is what government does, narrowly defined. So governance as a concept is broader than what government does. If I take the Swachh Bharat mission as an example, there is a scheme started by the Union government, but how it is implemented is a function of what citizens have done with it. The Smart Cities mission is also another example of the distinction between governance and government. In our texts, and I will define the texts later, in our texts, the counterpart of government was the king. And when I say our texts, I am essentially talking about the texts on Hinduism because that's what I'm familiar with. So the counterpart was the king. And as most people are aware, we had a cyclical view of time, divided into the four yugas: Satya Yuga or Krita Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Over a period of time, dharma progressively declined. The word dharma has many meanings in many different contexts, but one meaning of the word dharma, dharma, whatever holds up is dharma. Whatever sustains society is dharma. So the entire gamut of laws, the government structure which is built on those laws is also dharma. In Satya Yuga, there was no need for laws. There was no need for laws because people were naturally, voluntarily righteous. So therefore there was no need for king. And when our texts were told how the notion of a king first evolved. If I ask around about what the word king is in any of our languages, some people will say Nripa, some people will say Raja. The Sanskrit word is Rajan. There is a difference between Ripa as king, because Ripa means lord of men. Naradhipa also is a word for king, means lord of men. There is a difference between Ripa and Naradhipa and Rajan. Rajan, which gives rise to the word Raja, is a king who delights the subjects. So Rajan is much, much more than a narrow Ripa or Naradhipa. Excuse me. In our text we are told that in Satya Yuga, because people were naturally righteous, there was no need for a king. The notion of kingship began to evolve in Treta Yuga, and the first king, the first Rajan, was Prithu. And there's a completely tangential story which I'm not going to get into about how Prithu originated. So Prithu was the first king who was a Rajan. He set about rules of the game, he leveled the earth, he set up habitations, he set up rules for dealing with the environment, for agriculture, which is why the earth became his daughter and became Prithvi or Prithivi. What about the texts? The texts I essentially mean, when I am talking about the texts, I essentially mean texts in Sanskrit. There is an enormous corpus of texts in Sanskrit. Huge corpus. Most people are aware that Max Muller edited a series known as Sacred Books of the East. So if I look at the various texts that were translated the sacred books of the East, which were not only texts about Hinduism, but if I look at the texts on Hinduism translated, they are either on literature or they were on the Upanishads and a little bit on the Dharma Shastras. And a little bit on the Dharma Shastras. What are texts that pertain to Hindu Dharma? Most people will mention Vedanta. Most people will mention Upanishads. Many people will mention Bhagavad Gita. In our texts, there are four different objectives of life, objectives of human existence: Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Moksha is the pursuit of mukti, the pursuit of liberation, the pursuit of being freed from the bonds of worldly existence of samsara. Our texts say, including the Bhagavad Gita, that amongst crores and crores of people, only a few will be able to even aspire for moksha, or if they aspire, will be able to be freed from samsara. The rest of us are what? We are householders, grihasthas. Who composed Upanishads, Brahmanas, Aranyaka, the Vedanta literature? People who were in Vanaprastha and Sannyasa. How many people in the entire population are likely to retire to the forest, become Vanaprasthas, become those in Danaprastha, or those in Sannyasa? Very small. Bhutan has a population of about 800,000 now. And in that country, lamas are publicly funded. Even in that country, not more than 5% of the population consists of lamas. So therefore, if I try to define Hinduism only in terms of Vedanta and the Upanishads, I'm making a gross mistake. I'm ignoring the fact, as I said, that the bulk of the population then did exactly what we are doing now. Earn a living, hopefully through legitimate means, not pursue moksha dharma. So the question that therefore arises is, what is the dharma for householders, individuals? What is the dharma for communities? And what is the dharma for the king, Rajan? Those questions will not be answered in texts on Vedanta, because it's an irrelevant question for those texts. Those of you who know a little bit about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana, will know that they are referred to as Itihas. You will also probably know that according to belief, after composing the Mahabharata, Vedavyasa went on to compose 18 Mahapuranas. So this corpus is called Itihasa and Purana. It is also referred to as Pancham Veda, the fifth Veda, because it distills out the teachings of the Vedas in ways that are translatable into practices by individuals, householders, communities, and the king. So if you are going to talk about governance, in ancient texts, these are the texts we should look at. In addition to texts on Dharma Shastras, and there is a masterly multi-volume exploration history of the Dharma Shastras by the late P.V. Kane. We should be looking at that. We should be looking at the Niti Shastra literature. Niti means good policy, and there is a huge corpus of Niti Shastra literature. There is a huge corpus of Artha Shastra literature. If I mention governance and political economy, most people will mention Kautilya and Kautilya's Arthashastra. That manuscript was lost. References to it remained, but the manuscript was lost until Professor Kshama Shastri rediscovered it in 1905 and translated it. And these days, several people have begun to write on Kautilya, Kautilya's Arthashastra, and what it means for economy, political economy, and governance, including Professor Satish Deodhar. That's desirable. In passing, the dividing line between Dharma Shastra, Niti Shastra, and Artha Shastra is extremely thin. So sometimes it's very difficult to figure out whether something should be called Niti Shastra or Artha Shastra. A case in point being Kamandati's Niti Shastra. It's actually an Artha Shastra text following Kautilya. It is called Niti Shastra. It was quoted a couple of years ago in Economic Survey. Just one little bit from that. Anyway, So these are the texts we should be looking at. And they yield us enormous insights about what we can call governance, the dharma for the individual, the dharma for the community, the dharma of the king. Because of the shortage of time, let me state two polarized and ideal extremes. Two poles, neither of which exist in the real world. The first of it is capitalism, the ideal state of capitalism. I repeat, it does not exist anywhere in the world. But in a capitalist society, what happens? In a capitalist society, all decisions, all allocation decisions are taken by the market, by individuals. As a polar extreme, think of the ideal socialist state, where all allocation decisions were taken by the state, the government. So these are two polar extremes, the ideal state of capitalism and on the other side, the ideal state of socialism. If you read our texts, you will find we had a structure that was completely different. The king had a much more limited role. The Rajan had a much more limited role. Rajan's role was limited to ensuring external security and internal security. The Rajan's role was limited to ensuring speedy dispute resolution. The Rajan's role was limited to protecting the virtuous and punishing the wicked. That was the interpretation of the rule of law. The Rajan's role, in addition, involved the protection of property rights. And incidentally, with land revenue being the primary source of revenue, the Rajan received 1/6, which is what? Slightly less than 16% of GDP. So if you take a capital output ratio, I'm just being flippant, if you take a capital output ratio of 4, incremental capital output ratio of 4, and you do the maths, you will have a real growth rate of 4%. I'm sure the late Professor Rajkrishna had no particular reference to this when he flippantly talked about the Hindu rate of growth. But anyway, that is in past. Notice today, union government and state governments collect less than 15% of GDP as taxes. But our expectations on the part of the government are much more. As public expenditure, the government must spend 6% on education, 4% on health, 2% on infrastructure, 3% of defense. On defense, as percentages of GDP, we are already at 23%. As I said, the king's role was limited. In terms of priority of civil cases, these are the 19 different kinds of civil cases the king or the government must try, prioritize. And right at the top was breach of contract, thousands of years ago. Where is this from? Much before the World Bank's governance indicators. It is both from the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, where Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows, it is instructing Yudhishthira and his brothers, and it is also from the much maligned, much abused and rarely read Manu Samhita. That's on the civil side. Let's take the criminal side. A wealthy man guilty of a crime should not be imprisoned, because that is at the cost of the public exchequer. Instead, you should impose a monetary penalty. Only a poor person who cannot pay should be imprisoned. You may or may not agree with that value judgment, but you cannot deny that it has an impeccable logic of its own. Who said this? Not the law and economics guys from Chicago, not the World Bank. This was again said by Bhishma to Yudhishthira. So I've talked about the king, the counterpart of the government. Now let's talk about the community. Charan mentioned corporate social responsibility. Yes, today we want the National Skill Development Corporation. The government must deliver skills. We must have the Competition Commission, which must ensure that there are no restrictive business practices, no unfair business practices. The government must ensure that MRP was enforced. In those days, who did all this? The Srenis, for want of a better word, the guilds did it. All of these. Skill formation, MRP, trade practices, all of this was done by the Srenis. What has completely fallen into disuse is the role of the community. And I'm not talking about 3,000 years ago, 100 years ago. The British brought out district gazetteers. Originally, they brought out gazetteers for all of India, and then they brought out district gazetteers. The district gazetteer for the district of Ambala, 1883. I think it might also be Rotan, but I think it was Ambala, say near in any case. What is happening in Ambala in 1883? A canal has to be built. How much is that canal going to cost? In 1883 rupees, 45,000. So 45,000 rupees in 1883 rupees. Who paid this? 20,000 rupees was paid by the government of the day. The remaining 25,000 was paid by the community. I repeat, 20,000 was paid by the government of the day, the remaining 25,000 was paid by the community. Today you suggest something like this, and hell will break loose. Aren't we paying taxes to the government? Isn't the government supposed to do all this? Look at the state of waterworks in India. Even 100 years ago, before the Government of India Act of 1919, there were waterworks which were maintained by the community, all fallen into disuse. Because as communities we have abdicated our responsibility. As communities, it has happened since 1947 and even earlier, has led us to the belief that the government must do everything. And finally we come to the individual. The individual as a grihastha. The individual was supposed to do 5 things every day as Pancha Mahayagya. This is not merely sacrifices. Well, yajna means sacrifices, but these are sacrifices of a different kind. Amongst other things, before I eat, I must feed guests. Who are guests? If Charan invites me to his house for dinner, which he doesn't, let me assure you, I am not a guest. I am an abhyagata. So when it comes to Pancha Mahayagnas, it is not talking about guests who are known. It is known that they will come, so they are not guests. Who are guests? The word for guest that we constantly use is atithi, atithi deva bhava. Atithi means tithi. Tithi is the lunar day. Atithi is a guest who turns up unexpected, unannounced. So before I eat, I must feed atithis. Before I eat, I must feed animals and birds. And as part of my duties as a householder, I must perform Ishta and Purti. Ishta is sacrifices. Purti is like civic works. So if you like, the first is like revenue expenditure, the second one is like capital expenditure. And both of those have multiplier effects. And I must do this without the danda of the corporate social responsibility being exercised. What we have lost because of our expectations from the government of the state is this role played by the community and played by the individual. Part of this is because of the centralization the British brought about. But part of it is our own doing after 1947. There were 4 speeches that Deen Dayal Upadhyay delivered in April 1965. In slightly different words, he said something very similar. That unlike that socialism, unlike that capitalism, we have this. So when an atithi comes, if Charan invites me for dinner, I told you he does not. If Charan invites me for dinner and my wife will begin to think, what shall we take him as a gift? Does he drink? Will we take him a bottle of wine? We don't know whether he drinks. Let us take him a bouquet of flowers. Our concept of atithi was completely different. The atithi does a good act to the host. So the atithi does not take a gift. When the atithi comes, you give the atithi a gift. When I was in Niti, I used to travel to remote parts of the country, outside metros also. And if it was the time when a meal would be taken, the householder or the housewife would invariably tell me, have a meal with us and go, however poor that household is. This was the legacy, this was the parampara. which we are fast losing. Final words now. The reason I've been invited, I know I've been invited apart from Arvind and Charan's kindness, but I guess one of the reasons why I've been invited is because I'm translating the Itihas Purana corpus. The Itihasa corpus, as I said, means the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana. People constantly ask me why I'm translating them. Haven't they been translated before? Not quite. They've been translated in abridged form. The stories. So and so killed, so and so did, so and so. Those kinds of things have been done in the process of abridged retelling. Unabridged translations of the Mahabharata number only 3, including mine. Unabridged translations of the Valmiki Ramayana number only 5, including mine. And I am now translating the Puranas, which are 18 in number. I've just about finished the 6th. 4 have been published, 2 are in the pipeline, but doesn't matter. Why is a mad economist trying to do this? Because the Sanskrit pundits were not doing it. And there were others who knew the English but did not know the Sanskrit. Let me give 2 examples, and then I will stop. There is a text called the Markandeya Purana. It is named after the Rishi Markandeya. That itself is an interesting story about how it starts. It concerns questions about events that happened in the Mahabharata, but I don't have time to get into this. In the Markandeya Purana, there is a reference to a demoness named Jataharini. Jataharini, as the name implies, is a demoness who abducts newly born infants. So there is house A where there is a newly born infant. She steals that, goes to house B where there is a newly born infant, replaces that one with this one, steals that, goes to another house, does the same thing and generally causes confusion, and there are moral dilemmas because I've been born as a Brahman but I've been reared as a Kshatriya, what is my dharma going to be? All of that stuff. What the Markandeya Purana also tells us is Jataharini devours every 3rd child. What this is telling me is at the time when Markandeya Purana was composed, the infant mortality rate was 1/3 or 333 per 1,000. I'll take another example. This is about Vishnu's Matsya Avatara. Everyone knows the story of Matsya Avatara. The Matsya comes to Manu. Small little fish eventually becomes a big fish, caves in when there is the deluge. When it was a small fish, what kind of a fish was it? The Puranas were composed in different parts of India, 18 Puranas. When it was composed, when a Purana was composed in the southern coastal parts, that fish, small fish, is called a safari. What is a safari? Safari is a silvery white fish you find in the sea. When it is a Purana that was composed along the eastern side, that small fish is a Rohita fish, what we colloquially know as Rav. These 2 examples illustrate why we must bring a multidisciplinary lens to examine these texts, which, as I said in passing earlier, have not been looked at because they have been dismissed unnecessarily as myths. They are much more than stories. They are encyclopedias about geography, geology, beautiful poetry, and also governance. Thank you very much.
Professor Debroy, this is eye-opening. I did not know so much. I didn't even know iota of this. I used to read about this material, but it's an eye-opening. Thank you so much. Let's invite Professor Deodhar now for his observations. Professor Deodhar?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So at the outset, I was not able to connect through my laptop, so I'm on my mobile. Hopefully, my voice is clear to all of you. And if the
It is.
video gives, I can remove my video. Right?
The video and voice both are clear.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll start with the Sanskrit shloka. There's a shloka, a subhashit, which says that Khadyoto Dyotate Tavad Yavanna Udayate Shashi Udayate tu Sahasranshu Na Khadyoto Na Chandrama, which means that a firefly shines as long as moon has not risen, and the moon shines as long as the sun has not risen. uh, Having invited Professor Debroy, I'm not sure whether I'm going to make any light here or shine, but I'll make an attempt as a discussant, right? All right. So I think two things that came out of two or couple of things. I'll just touch upon two. What's the role of the government for governance and protecting property rights and many other issues, and where do you find the sources of this? Quickly, if somebody is interested in knowing the details of it, Narada giving advice to Yudhishthira. By the way, Yudhishthira received advice from many, because he was a Dharmaraj. So he was always in quandary what to do. So he received advices from many, including Arjuna also. But, if you look at Narada giving advice to Yudhishthira or Bhishma giving advice to Yudhishthira, there is a mature discussion on how a king should govern, right? And one can find those passages in Mahabharata. Even in Ramayana, Ram is telling Bharata how to govern in his absence, and you can figure out concepts of, public goods have to be provided, and if not subsidies, direct cash transfer. He's talking about taking care of the lame and the blind and the other poor people. So mature discussion has taken place. You will also find um, concepts of, let's say, there should not be a revenue deficit. Narada says, I hope, Yudhishthira, your expenses for yourself to govern are at most one third, one fourth, one third, or one half of your total revenues. Don't go beyond that. I think he is kind of bringing in the concept of revenue deficit. There should not be a revenue deficit. And probably even in today's context, we want to make sure probably that there are no revenue deficits. So that's quite an age-old concept that was talked about. Even taxation, Bhishma is saying that, look, how mature the simile Bhishma gives. He tells Yudhishthira that, look, just like the honeybee sucks honey from the flower, tax accordingly. You don't affect the bloom of the flower, but you do contribute to pollination. Similarly, you tax only as much so that the bloom of the firms, the private sector, is not lost, but you can use the revenue for the public goods. So there is a mature discussion of this. And also, how much is the role of the government or the governance of the king? Uh, there is reference in Purva Mimamsa. In Purva Mimamsa, the author is saying that, look, a king is there only to govern because we need to govern ourselves. But that does not mean that he can own everything that is there in the country. This is quite opposite of what is called as the eminent domain principle in the West. Eminent domain principle meant that Lord owns everything, you, me, and the earth and everything. And therefore, the Lord's representative was the king. And therefore, king got the right of eminent domain. He could confiscate anything. Unfortunately, during the British times, we inherited that act, and eminent domain principle existed. And therefore, for making dams and whatnot, lands were confiscated. In those times, in the early years of our independence, there was no social media. So many of the tribals' voices probably were not heard because their lands were confiscated. If you have come to Pune, there is a street called Senapati Bapat Road. The Senapati Bapat was the first one, to champion the causes of the farmers who or tribals who were displaced because of the dams. So I think that eminent domain principle, now we have taken care of it. I suppose we have amended the acts recently. What I'm saying is Purva Mimamsa talked about this. You cannot interfere in so that means private property was well protected. Even if you are a king, you are just supposed to govern. That doesn't mean that you own everything. So these concepts certainly were very much there. In fact, if you go back to our Vedic literature, Ma Gridha Kasya Svidanam, which means that do not covet somebody else's property. No, and these are millennia old, thoughts that have been expressed, and this is quite profound in my understanding. In fact, I'll just give last example and probably I'll quote, since Professor Debroy talked about there should not be too much of government interference, right? Or whether it's subsidy or whatever. The recent instances of government asking people to give up their LPG subsidy, right? Or even asking senior citizens who are well-to-do, don't take the discount for the senior citizen for your railway fares. I think this is coming from our own ancient sources, appeal to the dharma, to the righteous conduct, right? And in modern literature, in economic literature, we'll call this as behavioral economics. That economics goes much beyond utility maximization, but you are looking at society, societal interest, and this is and charity. So these concepts probably were well incorporated into our governance structures. I think these are few of the thoughts that came to my mind. As I said, having heard Professor Debroy, maybe I'm just a firefly, but these are my few of the thoughts that occurred to me. Thank you, Professor Singh.
So, I have one question, and then I will go over to Dr. Vishan Das. He also has a question, and then we'll open it up. And I assure you, sir, we'll close by 5. That is for sure. I know the time limit that you have. One thing, sir, that I've been struggling very hard is on the banking sector and the frauds that take place in the banking sector. Now, my thoughts were that would you and Professor Deodhar, if you have been at IIM Ahmedabad, you must be also struggling with people who come and ask you similar questions. So, Sir Professor Debroy, my thoughts were in the ancient literature, can I get some guidance which I can give my employees in the financial world that they have to conduct themselves with great responsibility, they have to maintain their ethical standards, otherwise it's not fair. So would I have some guidance from there, sir? Dr. Ashok, you want to ask your question now so that we economize on the time? Yeah. Yeah, Ashok, Dr. Ashok, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Charan. Thank you, Chair Dr. Bibek Deverai and Dr. Satish Devdar. It was a sir, masterful exposition. My question to A, in the current civil service, sir, you talked about the Raja and the Rajan. Rajan is the one who's the king but delights the subjects. And in likewise, something like this can be inculcated in the civil service capacity building, because mostly the civil servant of the current breed, they are rule based. Now they have to be converted into the role base. Therefore, all center training institutes such as Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, such things, sir, which you told, can be inculcated in the capacity building of the new breed, the new recruits of the various services, all India service, central services, or you have seen the 7 services in the railway and other service. So that is question one. So second, you told about 1883 there was some public project which cost about 45,000 at 1883 prices, and of only 20,000, that means less than 50% was contributed by the government of the day. and more than 50% by community. And I can see the logic behind it, because once the community contribute into that financially, they will have the ownership. So where we change it, and what are the competing reasons why the government cannot replicate that kind of thing, so that the public now, sir, we see when there is kind of anger anywhere, they first attack the public property, regardless whether it's a taxpayer. And now, once they contribute, it will be difficult for a common person to attack the public assets. Sir, over to you.
So let me take those questions. I don't know whether Satish Deodhar is still there or has he vanished.
He's there because of his camera problem. He's, I think, without the video. He's come.
You see, the last bit I already answered, because I think we have been pampered by some British colonial policies and what happened since 1947. So we abdicated both our duties as citizens and our duties as communities. Although let me remind you that the Constitution of India, in the directive principles of state policy, has also got duties and responsibilities of citizens. But let me backtrack a little bit, because that was the thrust of what I was trying to say, even if it did not become very explicit. I mentioned P. Carney's History of the Dharma Shastras. Is there anything equivalent for the history of governance, or the history of economic thought about governance in India? There isn't. Before I begin to implement anything, before I begin to inculcate anything in the syllabi for the civil services, I have to know what exists. It is only of late that people other than Indologists have begun to take an interest only in Kautilya. There was Rangarajan, there was Satish Deodhar's book. After that, recently there's been Sriram Balasubramanian's book, but all of that is essentially Kautilya. Satish Deodhar is absolutely right. You have the counterpart questions being asked of the king in both the Valmiki Ramayana and in the Mahabharata about what today we would call Sabka Saath Sabka Vikas. Our impression of Valmiki Ramayana is that there was Ram Rajya, that there are fantastic descriptions of what the kingdom was like when Dasharatha was the king. And it tells us about the council of ministers and the kinds of tests the king should use in choosing ministers. The point I'm making is a very simple thing. Like Kane, is there some resource that I can use without reading all these texts? The answer is no. Let me now react to Charan's question. Well, depending on the timeline, there were no banks in the sense we understand them today. There were money lenders. And there were rules about the rate of interest they could charge, but let me not get into that, including in Kautilya. Manusmriti. The monthly interest rate paid by Brahmanas must be X%. That paid by Kshatriyas must be Y%, and Y is greater than X. That paid by Vaishyas must be Z% and that is greater than Y. And that paid by Shudras must be the highest of the lot. All kinds of Indologists, beginning with Max Muller, typically from the West, have commented on this and said, look at this idiocy. Even the interest was linked to the Varna system. I'm not going to get into the issue of what Varna was. Varna was not caste in the sense that we understand it today, but anyway. So this was Manusmriti. In Kattayar Smriti, I find the following. What are Brahmanas going to use their money for, their borrowing for? They'll have sacrifices. They'll borrow small sums of money. What will Kshatriyas do? They will borrow larger sums of money. They wage wars. The outcome of a war is very uncertain. What will the Vaishyas do? They will borrow larger sums of money. They will take their ships and go out to trade. And God only knows what will happen to the ship. Very high risk. What will Shudras do? Using today's jargon, conspicuous consumption. Now looked at in this fashion, all that interest rate structure was doing was to build in a risk premium. And everyone today would understand the risk premium. I'm citing this example to make the same point. How do I know this? Because there is no common resource. Sometimes Satish Deodhar comes along and writes another book. Not one book, a multi-volume book like Kane. He will not have this information. That's the fundamental point I'm trying to make.
Professor Satish, you want to add something or you want to give another viewpoint?
Just an addendum. In fact, the motto of our civil services is Yogaha Karmasu Kaushalam. That means yoga is showing efficiency in administration. So, that also I think is, but in regarding, I think there is one text which is called as Shukra Niti Sara. It was written interestingly somewhere at the end of about 18th century. And it's an abridged version of original Shukra Niti, which doesn't exist today. Like the Kautilya Arthashastra was discovered only in the last century. Shukra Niti, that text is not available, but Shukra Niti Sara, an abridged version of that is available. And it talks about, are there any limits on how much interest can be charged, right? It's not in terms of interest rate. So if you have, let's say, paid interest component, which is 100% of the original principal, then you may not pay any additional interest. If you have paid total interest, which is 4 times the original borrowed amount, then you need not even repay the original principal. So there's a discussion of this. I have written a paper on this, which is on Shukra Niti Sara, which talks about these issues also. And the same paper, actually, Shukra Niti Sara, talks about how to measure the efficiency of the government servants. So I think that Shukra Niti Sara paper of late 1750s or early 1800, that talks about these issues.
We have run out of time. It's already 5. Let me thank each one of you to enrich the discussion and be present here. First and foremost, I want to thank Professor Debroy to have agreed to come and speak to us on this topic, which is great learning for us. And today, as you must have noticed, we have all learned from his 35 minutes exposition. Also want to thank Professor Deodhar. I approached him pretty late, and he kindly agreed. He's away from his place and he said, okay, Charan, I'm traveling. And that's why you find this, that he has some time moving from his laptop to his cell phone, because he's not in his headquarters. He's moving, and he agreed to kindly accept this request of ours. I have also to mention that tomorrow by noon, we will have it on our website. And next week, we have Jessica Seddon speaking to us. I'll send you the flyer. Once again, thanks to all of you for being with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Singh.